The headline on the other major news story today, to which we intend to devote some time, is very simple. Hello, Dolly. Dolly is the name of the first mammal, yes, a sheep, ever to be born as the result of cloning. Cloned from an adult sheep in a laboratory.
Humans are now hackable animals. You know, the whole idea that humans have, this, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will, that's over.
They go and they create a child in a petri dish and change its genetic code in a way that those genetic changes are passed on through generations. And so what we're doing literally is we're opening a Pandora's box. We're playing with the genetic code of humanity.
The dead will walk again.
CRISPR technology has caught the eye of a high-profile backer.
It was 8 years ago that CRISPR came along and continues to evolve in some pretty fantastic ways.
Genetics, what can it mean? The ability to perfect the physical and mental characteristics of every unborn child.
Those claims overnight that the world's first genetically edited babies have been born.
Dead will walk again.
At this point in the series, we've already established how the classic zombie narrative has mutated from a simple horror story into something more like a cultural script. And we've watched how decades of movies and TV shows, books, and video games have trained us to brace for collapse and to see our neighbors as potential threats, to expect outbreak and to distrust community, to normalize violence, and even to accept the idea that government tyranny might be justified when the stakes are high enough. We've explored its cultural influence, psychological conditioning, its spiritual symbolism, and we've started to expose an agenda that seems to just keep resurrecting this zombie storyline generation after generation. But now it's time to cross the line, because everything up to this point has existed safely within the realm of fiction, inside movie theaters, on television screens, and in the pages of graphic novels or paperback books. But what if I told you that some of the things that we've always dismissed as zombie fiction just happen to overlap with research and burgeoning biotechnology that's unfolding right now in the real world? Nothing that I'm about to show you is science fiction. I didn't pull any of this from internet conspiracy forums or fringe websites. No, this material comes straight from the mainstream, from publicly documented sources, peer-reviewed research, federal grants, DARPA projects, biotech patents, and academic labs. It's all publicly documented and openly discussed in professional circles. And here's a quick disclaimer for the sake of the algorithm. I am not claiming that governments or scientists or any institutions are secretly plotting to engineer a zombie apocalypse. So let me be clear about that. Any parallels that I draw in this video between these topics and a theoretical zombie outbreak are purely speculative on my part. I'm just exploring the idea that if the powers that be ever wanted to create such a scenario, that these are some of the tools that could theoretically be used. But to understand how, we first need to strip away the theatrics of the Hollywood version of the zombie though. The rotting corpse dragging itself out of the graveyard. And instead, let's define a zombie in more grounded and functional terms. As a mindless human body whose autonomy is overridden, compelled to act aggressively, and driven by impulses that are no longer self-directed. And when viewed through this lens, the zombie narrative suddenly shifts from mere fiction into something scientifically conceivable. In fact, not just conceivable, but something that already exists in nature, and you don't need to look any further than your own backyard to see it. Take Toxoplasma gondii. It's a microscopic parasite that infects rodents. So think of mice, for example. Under normal circumstances, mice hate the smell of cat urine. I mean, who doesn't, right? But mice actually fear the odor of cat urine instinctively, which is a good thing because it keeps them away from cats. But once infected, that fear is rewired. The mouse becomes attracted to the scent instead, and it's pulled directly towards a predator that will kill it. So the parasite doesn't just make the mouse sick, it reprograms its behavior and essentially guides it towards its own death for the parasite's benefit. Another classic example is rabies, the well-known pathogen that seems like something pulled straight out of a zombie movie. Rabies infects mammals by inflaming the brain, overriding normal inhibition, and triggering violent, irrational aggression. So a rabid animal loses control of its behavior and becomes compelled to attack and to bite others, spreading the virus through its saliva. And much like Toxoplasma, rabies rewires a creature's instincts so that they no longer serve their own survival, but the survival of the virus. And then you got the infamous Ophiocordyceps fungus. And this one's pretty nasty. It's a fungus that infects insects. It hijacks their motor control and behavior and forces them to climb to a specific height and then locks their jaws in place and kills them, which allows for the fungus to erupt from their bodies and release its spores. So if you've ever seen this on the Discovery Channel, then you already know how disturbing it is to watch, yet its resemblance to zombie lore is just unmistakable. But in case you're thinking that these horrifying acts of nature only affect animals and insects, you need to understand that humans are no exception.
This man developed symptoms of rabies. He displays a characteristic restlessness and agitation. As a precaution against the convulsions which commonly occur in rabies, the patient is secured hand and foot.
So you got something called prions, and prions may be the most zombie-like phenomenon found in nature, affecting both humans and animals alike. They are misfolded proteins that force other proteins in the brain to misfold as well, and that triggers a chain reaction. Prions are the cause behind such things as mad cow disease and chronic wasting disease, which is often called zombie deer disease.
Lucy, Grizzy! Oh, it's hurt so bad.
But what's even more disturbing is that it can be transmitted to humans through eating contaminated meat, which slowly destroys the brain and results in profound cognitive collapse, drastic personality changes, loss of coordination, and then eventual death, leaving behind a human body that still persists long after the mind has faded away.
Mad cow disease in this country.
BSE is mad cow disease, a potentially deadly brain-wasting infection that can be transferred to humans.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease made headlines back in the 1990s after an outbreak of what came to be known as mad cow disease. The symptoms of mad cow resembled Creutzfeldt-Jakob, but researchers determined it was in fact a variation of CJD, contracted when victims ate beef from cattle infected with a similar but different mutant protein.
And keep in mind that that was just a short list, but many more examples exist. In fact, nature is full of viruses and parasites that can invade a living body, erase its agency, and control it according to a process that it can't resist. And that's why the classic zombie storyline resonates so deeply with us, because it was never pure imagination. In fact, throughout history, we've observed and documented many real cases where living creatures are hijacked and controlled by an external force. And that's what makes it work so well as a horror plot, because the most effective stories are always anchored in truth. As they say, art imitates reality. But in the same way that art imitates reality, we should also recognize that technology often imitates nature. The truth is that science and engineers don't create in a vacuum, and that new technologies are rarely discovered. They're more often achieved by reverse engineering systems that God already designed. And for decades, researchers have been studying the biological processes that we just detailed and searching for ways to isolate, amplify, or even reproduce them through man-made means. And the reality is that we now live in a time when science is capable of manipulating human behavior in ways that nature never could. Breakthroughs in biotechnology have delivered tools that are able to alter how people think, feel, and act. First you got CRISPR, which actually allows scientists to modify human genes.
Well, I saw that biology is this interesting technology, and maybe different aspects of biology can be kind of hacked. This idea of a biohacker, as opposed to, say, a computer hacker, started to be born in my mind.
If you make your offspring immune to Alzheimer, why not also give them an enhanced metabolism? Why not throw in perfect eyesight? How about height or muscular structure? Full hair? How about giving your child the gift of extraordinary intelligence? Huge changes are made as a result of the personal decisions of millions of individuals that accumulate. This is a slippery slope. Modified humans could become the new standard.
If you could get a tiny injection that could prevent your child from getting cancer, would you do it? Okay, what about whilst you're at it, you could also choose their eye color, or their height, or their skin tone? Where would you draw the line?
Some scientists even think biological aging could be something that eventually just stops being a thing. We would still die at some point, but instead of doing so in hospitals at age 90, we might be able to spend a few thousand years with our loved ones.
The coolest thing about CRISPR is not necessarily all the genes it can edit and all the things like this. It's that everybody's interested in genetic engineering now, right? Even people who are anti-GMO or didn't like GMOs, now those people are interested in genetic engineering because of CRISPR.
But what happened in the past few years is we found easy to reprogram tools that will allow us to edit our genes. And that's going to be 10 times more impactful than the digital revolution was.
What would stop a totalitarian regime from engineering an army of modified super soldiers? It is doable in theory.
Change the way we think about being human. Instead of just everybody being born with the genetics they have for their whole life, maybe we can start changing that up. And for interesting and fun stuff, everything doesn't have to be everybody, cure this disease, cure that disease. It's we get tattoos and stuff like that. Why can't we, grow a tail or grow wings, or how much scientific research has gone into growing a tail in human beings? Probably none. But a lot of people probably think that's pretty cool. Companies can do that if this technology opens up. Or growing wings. Who knows if that's even possible? Probably not. But nobody's trying, right?
But wait, because there's more. Engineered viruses that can deliver genetic material into brain cells and change neural activity that influences cognition and mood and emotions.
We could, in effect, think up properties that we might want, say, a microorganism to have, good properties or bad properties, figure out what genetic sequence you need, upload it, boot the thing up, and away you go. So we're at the cusp of that revolution, and we could achieve wonderful things for humanity, but terrible things as well.
And then there's deep brain stimulation, also known as DBS, which can actually adjust neural networks, reducing fear, controlling impulses, and dramatically shifting mood or emotional responses.
Does DBS change your personality? Deep brain stimulation, or DBS, involves placing electrodes in specific areas of the brain to adjust neural activity. This method is used for various conditions, including addiction. It targets brain regions linked to reward, motivation, and behavior control.
There's optogenetics, which uses light to control cells. And while human applications are really only experimental, in lab animals, it can switch behaviors like fear or aggression on and off with extreme precision.
Optogenetics is the ability to manipulate individual neuronal circuits, refining our vision as a function of individual circuits and how they relate to different aspects of our behavior and of our personality. This part of the brain contains many kinds of neurons, and they're all intermingled. If you activate a certain subset of them with optogenetics, you can make a rat freeze up and have difficulty walking. If you activate a different subset, the rats start moving faster. So imagine if we could use optogenetics or a similar technology to get the input from an artificial sensor into our brain. In principle, we could not only restore function, we could enhance our current functions. So we could give ourselves ultraviolet light detectors, for example, the way mantis shrimps have. Or we could take an example from fruit flies and give ourselves carbon dioxide detectors, and then we could automatically sense our air quality. It's really, really fun to fantasize about the future. You know, in 10 years' time, we might all be enhanced with implants.
You got implantable brain-computer interfaces, like Neuralink, which can wirelessly stimulate neural circuits, directly interacting with the human brain.
Elon Musk's brain implant company Neuralink said on Thursday it had been given a green light from the US FDA to kickstart its first-in-human clinical study. It's a critical milestone for Neuralink after earlier struggles to gain approval.
We're confident that it is possible to restore full-body functionality.
A major milestone marked in Miami. The first microchip backed by Elon Musk was implanted into a patient's brain at a local hospital. It is part of a clinical trial giving people who are paralyzed the ability to control their phones or their computers with just their mind.
Louisiana woman is making medical history. Well, she's the first woman in the world to receive the Neuralink brain implant, an experimental technology that could revolutionize healthcare.
Toronto is making medical history tonight. A tiny brain chip is giving Canadians with paralysis the power to control technology using nothing but their thoughts.
And then there's nanoscale neurotechnologies, or neural dust, which is being developed to interact with the human brain remotely without any need for bulky hardware or expensive medical equipment.
Now, University of California engineers have created a tiny wireless sensor they call neural dust. Smaller than a grain of rice, neural dust is less irritating to the body than conventional electronic implants, which connect to the nerves using wires and can cause inflammation. Instead, the wireless sensors convert ultrasound vibrations into electricity and then transmit information to a receiver outside the body.
And with the advent of artificial intelligence, who even knows what they'll come up with next? As of today, AI-assisted neurostimulation systems are already being used to optimize and to personalize brain stimulation in real time. And this is capable of recalibrating emotional states and altering perception and even influencing behavior with unprecedented precision. Now, to be fair to the institutions behind this research, all of these tools were officially developed for medical and scientific purposes. And in principle, it's pretty easy to see their potential benefits, like treating disease or stabilizing mental health and even preventing violence. But that same capability cuts both ways. Because just imagine what could happen if those same institutions were actually corrupt. What if channels like this one are actually correct? And there really is a genuinely satanic agenda that operates behind the scenes of this fallen world. Because if that's true, then it's worth recognizing that these very same technologies could be redirected towards the opposite ends. Not to improve behavior, but to control it. Not to stabilize the mind, but to destabilize it. Not to prevent violence, but to provoke violence. Well, for now, I guess we can only speculate about how far these capabilities might go or how they might be used. But what isn't speculative is this, that these technologies already exist, that the science behind them advances every year, and that history has already shown us that the military-industrial complex is not only capable of pursuing destructive agendas, but does it all the time, and is able to do so while successfully deceiving the public about its true intentions. And to be clear, this isn't some type of sudden development either. Many of you were around in the 1990s when fears about human cloning were dominating the headlines. And since then, we've watched steady breakthroughs in gene editing and synthetic biology and biotechnology for decades now, So the truth is that humanity has already been moving in this direction for a long time. But what is new, however, is the speed of these developments. And the pace of technological advancement over just the last few years has been truly unprecedented. Think back to the COVID era, because in that short window, when much of the working world was forced to move online, the smart grid infrastructure didn't just grow, it totally exploded. And during the lockdowns, when everybody was being told to stay home to save lives, major advancements in artificial intelligence and in biotechnology were unfolding in parallel, and largely out of sight. And things like ChatGPT and other breakthrough AI systems were becoming publicly available while we were still wearing face masks. And all the while, this new technological infrastructure was simultaneously being implemented all over the world, quietly and in the background. And then one day, the pandemic was just suddenly over, just as quickly as it began. And we all reemerged into a brave new world that had been fundamentally changed, and reconfigured for seamless, constant connectivity. A world that was far more integrated and automated and dependent on these smart systems than the one that we had left behind. And then today, we are suddenly living inside a dense web of smart devices and wireless systems that are powered by artificial intelligence. The so-called Internet of Things is no longer just a theoretical concept, it's already here. You got phones, watches, vehicles, homes, medical devices, wearables, everything. It's just always on, always connected, and always advancing. And that's not even accounting for the inevitable rollout of implantable biotech devices that are most certainly waiting for us just over the horizon. So pause with me for a moment and consider just how interconnected this modern world has become. Not in terms of human relationships, but in terms of our constant entanglement with this technology itself. And ask yourself this: what happens when everything we just described is combined with a borderless, wireless, and always online network? Well, I'm no scientist, but it sounds to me like a recipe for remote-controlled people. And it's getting harder to ignore the reality that we seem to be approaching an era where human beings themselves can function like programmable biological devices. Or, as Yuval Harari famously put it, that humans are hackable animals.
Humans are now hackable animals. The whole idea that humans have, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will, that's over. Today, we have the technology to hack human beings on a massive scale.
You see, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. These are real capabilities that have already been demonstrated, and governments understand this. That's why military institutions around the world have poured billions of dollars into research that's aimed at reviving critically wounded soldiers, or suppressing pain and fear, or enhancing aggression and merging biology with machinery, and pushing human endurance beyond natural limits. These pursuits are not speculative. This is real stuff, it's patented, and it's all being openly marketed as the future of humanity. And I'm not arguing that all biotech is inherently evil either, but we're not talking about hearing aids or pacemakers or artificial limbs or even medical implants that can restore lost function or heal damaged bodies to their natural state. No, natural has nothing to do with this. This is something entirely different, because things like neural implants or wireless brain modulation and genetic overrides are not designed to restore normal human function. They're designed to alter it. We're talking about a fundamentally different kind of transformation here. Technologies that are capable of influencing cognition or impulse and emotion and even decision-making itself. it's not about medical progress. It's about controlling the most sacred aspect of what even makes us human, our God-given capacity for free will, and agency and moral choice. So if you're wondering what any of this has to do with zombies, then I guess you're not connecting the dots. So just think back to how we defined zombies earlier, not as movie monsters, but as human beings whose autonomy has been hijacked, whose behavior is externally directed, and whose will is no longer their own. And then ask yourself, could those conditions be produced using the technologies that we've already examined? Well, even if they could, I'll be the first to admit that using any of them to engineer an actual zombie-like apocalypse still sounds pretty ridiculous, because after all, a zombie outbreak implies that there's a horde of zombies, it's not just an individual person laying in a hospital bed. So even if you could accept the premise that our governing authorities might ever conspire to do such a thing, the notion of rounding up thousands of people for CRISPR modification or deep brain surgery, or optogenetic intervention just to recreate a classic horror movie scenario is still frankly absurd. But within the framework of emerging remote biotechnologies, the idea becomes a lot more plausible. Because even if only a substantial segment of the population were to receive neural implants that could be remotely hacked, then activating large numbers of people wouldn't require individual intervention at all. It could become as simple as flipping a switch. Now, whether or not the rulers of this world would ever choose to do something like that, well, that's for you to decide. But the reality is this: these technologies are either already here or they're rapidly being developed. And the mechanisms capable of overriding human autonomy are real and documented, and it's all advancing at breakneck speed. So you could call that transhumanism, you could call it biotechnology, but what I see it as is spiritual warfare in its most literal and urgent form. See, you need to understand that spiritual warfare is not limited to private temptations and moral struggles or daily sins. I mean, those things are real and they are important, but that's only what's on the surface. Beneath it all is an active, coordinated war that's being waged right now in the physical world. I'm talking a real war. It's a battle for dominion over the human soul. And scripture makes it clear in Ephesians 6:12 that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So it's not really science who is trying to play God. No, according to scripture, Satan is the one who imitates God. And being the God of this world, as he is described several times in the Bible, the systems of this world, like the scientific institutions, are ultimately just tools at his disposal. So from a spiritual standpoint, whatever the publicly stated intentions are behind these technologies or scientific pursuits, they don't really matter very much. The institutions themselves may have their own strategic, ideological, or military objectives, but honestly, their plans have no bearing on the actual endgame. Because while we experience life under the authority of this world's systems, we often forget that those systems themselves operate under the authority of Satan, whether they know that or not. Yet even Satan's authority is not his own. He's only been granted a temporary dominion over the world by the one who truly sits at the top, and that's God himself. And it's God himself who has warned us through his prophets that Satan's reign will culminate one day in the end times with mass deception and a system of control so complete and so pervasive that it will demand total allegiance from all of society. So that's what this technology is building towards. And when that day comes, those who refuse to worship him and refuse to take his mark will face persecution and ultimately death, as faithful believers are hunted, executed, and even beheaded for their obedience to God. And by the way, if you can see how that scenario kind of mirrors all the social conditioning that we've been looking at and the mindless violence of zombie entertainment that we've traced through this series, then you're starting to grasp the full scope of Deadworld. But that's all I'm going to say for now, because the brutal reality of a future where obedience to God demands the ultimate sacrifice is sort of the premise of the final chapter of this project. But the real point that I'm trying to make here is this. When it comes to exploring the plausibility of a real-life zombie scenario, the question isn't really whether governments or scientific institutions would ever pursue something like this. It's whether Satan would. Because remember, Satan is the ultimate deceiver, And scripture tells us that he seeks to imitate God. You know, like I said before, it's not so much science that wants to play God, it's Satan who wants to play God. But the problem is that, unlike God, Satan is not omnipotent or omniscient or omnipresent. See, God is all-powerful, and Satan is not. And so he tries to counterfeit God's power. And in my opinion, that's exactly what he's trying to do through science and technology, to replicate a power that he doesn't possess. You know, he's not omnipresent, so a worldwide connected system, or an Internet of Things, makes sense. A manufactured grid that's capable of monitoring and influencing and connecting everybody all at once. And Satan is not omniscient or all-knowing, you know, so having direct access to the minds and thoughts and behaviors and actions of all humanity would be invaluable to him. And of all the godlike attributes that Satan has tried to imitate, there is one ability that continues to evade him completely, and that's the ability to create life. And maybe that has something to do with why we're now facing this explosion of synthetic biology that we've been covering, you know, and things like genetic engineering and artificial life sciences. And when you consider these things in that context, then ask yourself, what is the greatest miracle that Jesus Christ ever performed through the power of God? And the answer is resurrection. See, Christ's resurrection stands as the most glorious and undeniable demonstration of God's divine authority that this world has ever witnessed. It's the power over death itself. And I would argue that there's no miracle that Satan would desire to achieve more than that one. But of course, he doesn't have that power. And this is where his worldly institutions of science and technology come into play.
I should like to tell you that I have seen some of the experiments shown in this film actually carried out at the All-Russian Physiological Congress. As you can imagine, technique is everything. Isolated organs can be brought to life even though they've been removed from the animal's corpse some time after death. Here's a dog's heart. It can function as well in artificial conditions as in a living organism, and for this purpose, blood is introduced into the cardiac vessels. The isolated heart beats just as it did a few hours previously in the living dog. An animal's head can also live in the isolated condition. Here is the plan of the experiment. The arterial pump takes arterial blood from the reservoir to the head, while the venous pump drains off the venous blood. The blood is arterialized in the reservoir, where there is a steady flow of oxygen. The artificial blood circulation ensures the metabolism necessary for the life of the head. The isolated head lives on for hours and reacts to external stimuli. After 10 to 12 days, the dog returns to its normal state. After the experiment, dogs live for years, they grow, they put on weight, and have families.
Well, we're going to become increasingly non-biological to the point where the non-biological part predominates and the biological part is not that important anymore. In fact, the non-biological part, the machine part, will be so powerful it can completely model and understand the biological part. So even if that biological part went away, it wouldn't make any difference because the non-biological part already understood it completely. We'll also have non-biological bodies. We can create bodies with nanotechnology. We can create virtual bodies in virtual reality that The virtual reality will be as realistic as real reality. The virtual bodies will be as detailed and convincing as real bodies. We'll have different ways we can create bodies. We do need a body. Our intelligence is directed towards a body, but it doesn't have to be this frail biological body that's subject to all kinds of failure modes. And so we'll be routinely able to change our bodies very quickly. In addition to radical life extension, we're going to have radical life expansion. We're going to have millions of virtual environments to explore. So we're not going to get bored. If that weren't the case, then I think, living for hundreds, thousands of years would be a profound philosophical nightmare. But instead, we're headed for radical life expansion.
Which brings us full circle to the central question that this entire series was built to confront. Has modern technology reached a point where human beings could be brought back from the dead? Well, the honest answer is kinda, and possibly. And more importantly, it is something that modern science is actively pursuing. But to understand what that truly means, we first have to ground ourselves in biblical reality. Because the truth is that human beings are not merely animals or biological machines. We are spiritual beings, created in the image of God and with eternal souls. In Scripture, death is not the end of existence, but a separation. The body returns to dust, while the spirit returns to the God who gave it. So true resurrection is not simply restarting a heart or rebooting brain activity. It's a divine miracle, the restoration of both body and soul, reunited and glorified by the power of God. In fact, this is the very heart of the gospel. During his ministry, Jesus raised at least 3 people from the dead, but he didn't merely resuscitate them. They were resurrected by his sovereign authority over death itself. And then, in an ultimate victory, Christ himself rose from death, to never die again, conquering sin and death, bearing the punishment for the sins of the world, and opening a way of salvation for all who believe. And we've already covered this pretty thoroughly in Chapter 1, so I don't want to belabor the point anymore, but the zombie genre has twisted this sacred miracle into a mockery, and has replaced the glory of the true resurrection with an image of a rotting corpse clawing its way out of the grave. But the point is that resurrection is not a fictional concept born out of horror movies. It's a real sacred truth that's rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. But here's the irony. While secular science has spent decades mocking biblical resurrection as a myth, or dismissing it as a superstition or a fairy tale, behind the scenes, they've been quietly pouring billions of dollars into pursuing their own version of that very same miracle. Cryonics companies like Alcor and the Cryonics Institute are already preserving hundreds of dead bodies and even detached heads in liquid nitrogen, betting that a future technology will be able to bring them back to life. And many people dismiss that as science fiction or just a running joke from Futurama, but it's actually a serious scientific endeavor. And meanwhile, you got billionaires who are pouring vast amounts of money into startup companies that are chasing biological immortality. Biotech firms are experimenting with reanimating animal brains hours after death.
Yale researchers have reanimated decapitated brains of pigs, keeping them active for up to 36 hours. The advancement was announced during a meeting at the National Institute of Health. Steve Human of the Broad Institute told MIT Technology Review it's at the extreme of technical know-how, but not that different from preserving a kidney, adding, it may come to the point that instead of people saying, freeze my brain, they say, hook me up and find me a body.
And DARPA and private laboratories are exploring things like suspended animation and whole body preservation and even neural mapping, which is pretty much just digitizing the human brain with intentions of uploading human consciousness into computer systems or humanoid robotic bodies. And all of this is going on in the background while the leaders of the transhumanist movement are openly and publicly declaring that death itself is merely a problem to be solved. So they're not calling it resurrection, but that's exactly what they're pursuing, a man-made version of bringing the dead back to life. And some of the scientific methods that are being explored for these resurrection technologies are the same ones that we've already covered earlier in this video. And just like I said then, there's still many more examples that I don't even have time to mention, where real-world science is now overlapping with things that used to be dismissed as only science fiction, things that we would only associate with dystopian horror movies. But here's just a few more examples. You got researchers that are growing miniature brains in laboratories, and these miniature brains are able to generate their own electrical activity. You got something called Yamanaka factors, which scientists are using to reset aging cells, making them behave like younger versions of themselves. When we're creating synthetic blood that can extend endurance beyond normal limits, and even something like lab-grown meat is a concept that previous generations would have only ever seen in some kind of weird dystopian horror movie, And yet today, it's already being rolled out at some grocery stores.
Electronic mind control research is not new. A scientific milestone in this area came in the 1960s when Dr. Jose Delgado demonstrated remote control over a charging bull. By connecting a radio antenna to electrodes inserted into the bull's brain, Delgado proved that the animal's aggressive impulses could be thwarted by electronically manipulating the bull's muscle reflexes.
You may think you have little in common with this robot, but it is controlled by living brain cells much like those inside your own head. Researchers grew a collection of around 300,000 rat brain cells in the lab. The cells quickly grow connections to each other and start communicating using electrical pulses.
Here's where artificial intelligence overlaps with biology, which most people don't think typically go together. So a few months ago, a brand new AI model called Evo launched. It uses biology, the language of biology, so that's DNA, RNA, and proteins, to make predictions and enable design. So if you're using ChatGPT to help write your emails, you're going to use a system like this to help you come up with new types of materials. Which means that soon after generative AI is generative biology. And that may feel like it doesn't impact every single person in this room, but bear with me because it does.
Do you realize the fantastic possibilities if from the outside we could modify the inside? Could we give messages to the inside? But the beauty is that now we are not using electrodes.
In recent years, Delgado has shown that the behavior of monkeys can be altered using low-power, pulsating magnetic fields. But in these experiments, there were no antenna implants.
Any function in the brain, emotions, intellect, personality, could be perhaps modified by this non-invasive technology.
So one of the divisions at Google, DeepMind, built an AI tool. They built a ton of AI tools, but one of the tools is this thing called GNOME. And here's what's very interesting about this tool. It created 2.2 million new materials, which is unheard of. There's no way that human scientists could have done this on their own. But through simulations and again, combining AI and bio, 380,000 of them are stable enough that they could power future technologies.
The output from these cells can be used to control the robot's motor circuits, preventing it from bumping into obstacles. The team plan to use their robot's brain power for new patterns of behaviour in future. They hope there are enough similarities to teach us about unknown aspects of our own brain activity.
Delgado's research has so far been limited to animals, but in the Soviet Union, a radio frequency, or RF device, has been used for over 30 years to manipulate the moods of mental patients.
So, long story short, we now have cells like this, which are being used to create new types of computers. Which means that what's on the horizon are biocomputers made out of human brain cells.
And as one more disturbing example, and perhaps the most obvious one of all, we need to address cloning. Because as we are all aware, cloning in and of itself is not science fiction. I mean, animals have been cloned for decades. Sheep, cows, dogs, cats, even primates. The process itself is well understood, but the real controversy is the idea of human cloning. And despite the fact that this has been in the headlines for over 30 years at this point, a lot of people don't even realize that there are scientists out there who claim to have already cloned human beings. One example is Dr. Panayotis Zavos, a fertility researcher who publicly documented the creation of cloned human embryos and claimed to have implanted them into women.
A controversial fertility doctor has made a shocking claim, insisting that he's cloned human embryos and implanted them.
Dr. Panayotis Zavos claims to have cloned 14 human embryos, the genetic equivalent of Xerox copies.
Nobody has done this before.
Not only that, he says he implanted the cloned embryos in the wombs of 4 different women. For genetic researchers, human cloning is completely taboo. On that, the Pope and the President agree.
We're not going to be judged by the politicians and the clergymen, but rather by the fertility or infertility patients, rather, that need to have a child, a biological child of their own.
But what makes it even more pertinent to the Deadworld series is that some of those embryos were created using DNA taken from dead bodies. And I'm not making this up. His work was featured in outlets like 60 Minutes Australia and elsewhere on Australian television, and a lot of scientific documentaries as well.
Dr. Zavos also reveals he's produced cloned embryos from 3 dead people, including Katie, who died in a car crash. He injected her DNA into a cow egg, though he hasn't implanted the animal-human hybrid.
And another major figure was Dr. Severino Antinori. In May 2002, Antinori publicly announced that 3 women were pregnant with cloned human embryos, and they were between 6 and 10 weeks along into their pregnancy. No confirmed births were ever publicly shown, but the claims themselves were never retracted. Antinori later said that secrecy was necessary because he feared that the cloned children would be treated as monsters.
And can you tell us where this will be?
When exactly, I don't really want to speak about that.
You don't want to speak of where?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I need to respect, to protect this project, these people.
And then there's Clonaid, an organization that's directly tied to the infamous UFO cult known as the Raelian movement. And if you want to know more about the Raelian cult and their leader Rael, we've already done a deep dive into them on this channel in the Heavens and the Earth series, so feel free to check that out. But anyways, the Raelians believe that cloning is the pathway to immortality.
Religious people who are against human cloning should be free to refuse it for themselves or their own children, as they are free today to refuse abortion, blood transfusion, or surgery. Human cloning will make it possible for us to reach eternal life. It is the right of the people who want to enjoy the fruit of scientific progress, including human cloning and eternal life, to benefit from it. If religion and superstition, which are the same, had power over science, we will still be living in the dark age. Your great constitution includes the freedom of religion, and that means also the freedom to be atheist, freedom to believe that there is no God and benefit from science without any moral restriction. We Raelians believe that science should be our religion, as science saves lives while religion and superstition kill. Science destroys superstition and supernatural belief. That's why religion was always an enemy of science and progress, and is again trying to stop science at its best. It should be the freedom of the people to decide if they want to benefit or not from human cloning. Legalizing human cloning is protecting the right of the unreborn, as cloning makes it possible a second chance to live for infants, like the one Clonaid planned to clone now, a 10-month-old baby killed by medical malpractice.
And in 2002, Clonaid announced that the very first cloned human baby had been born. A little baby girl named Eve. Yeah, as in like Eve from the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. And this was followed by claims of additional cloned children and dozens of implanted embryos. And these statements were made publicly, and some even under oath, yet no DNA proof was ever released.
Now, Clonaid's CEO, Bridget Bosselier, made this announcement. Please, listen.
Very, very pleased to announce that the first baby clone is born. The parents are American citizen. The mother is 31. She is the one who has been cloned, and she carried her baby.
Now, whether every one of these claims is true or not, well, your guess is as good as mine. But the implications are impossible to ignore, because we have now reached a moment in history when the creation of human bodies is no longer a fictional concept. But scripture tells us that all life comes from God, and it's God alone who knits each person together in the womb, and that every human life is intentionally formed by his hand. And that has some major implications on the human soul too, because according to scripture, it's God who gives the breath of life. And so whether or not a cloned or reanimated human being could have a soul is a question that I can't answer. I mean, that topic has been debated since long before the science was ever even conceivable. But one thing is now clear. The question is no longer whether science could imitate resurrection. The real question is who, or rather what, is actually being brought back. And for everything that we've explored in this chapter, I just want to drive home the fact that none of these fields are considered fringe. These are standard and respected scientific pursuits. But when viewed side by side, and when you consider the potential ways that they could be used or misused, I think it's fair to at least ask the question, is a real-life zombie-like scenario possible? Well, I think that we've already established enough evidence to indicate that, yes, it is. So does that imply that a zombie-like apocalypse is inevitable? Well, no, of course not. But here's the real question. Is it plausible? Is it even worth your consideration? I mean, just because it might be technically possible to manufacture a zombie outbreak doesn't necessarily mean that it's likely, right? After all, it's not like our government and militaries have actually drafted contingency plans for a zombie apocalypse. Or have they? Well, to find out, make sure that you're subscribed to Fallen World Films, because in the next chapter, we dig into the official military strategies and government protocols that reveal just how far authorities have gone to prepare for a real-world zombie scenario. And if you enjoyed or appreciated this video, please remember to hit the like button, because that really helps the channel more than you might realize. So stay tuned and sit tight, because believe it or not, we're still just getting started.